If you're looking at a beginning Greek grammar and you're trying to decide which one, there are going to be a couple of things, maybe three things you want to look at and a little bit carefully and figure them out. So in this video, I'm going to talk about how I evaluate beginning Greek grammars. You can see I've done a few of these over the last 12 months as I've been on this YouTube channel. So I'm going to talk you through some of the things I'm looking for, trying to consolidate them a little bit, and then give you tips so that you know what to look for if you're looking for a beginning Greek grammar too. And if you're writing a grammar or teaching, this should also be helpful. Let's get into it. In this video, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the key things to look for in a beginning Greek grammar. And there are three kinds of audience really I have in mind for this. First of all, there are those who are going through beginning Greek either for the first time or as a refresher. Okay, so I have you in mind for in one sense. A second group I have in mind is those who are teaching beginning Greek, because if you're teaching beginning Greek, you want to make a choice about which grammar you want to work with, and you want to do that with a bit of knowledge. And often we just teachers often fall back on the grammar they were taught using, so if you went through Machen, you're going to go and teach Machen because that's what you're familiar with. But that's not always the best option, and particularly today when there are so many good Greek grammars around, there are some really good options to consider. So I want to talk to teachers of biblical Greek as well. And the third group of people are really those who are writing Greek grammars. Now, there's not lots of people out there writing Greek grammars, and they may not even watch this YouTube video, and that's fine. But I have these people in mind as well, mostly because I realize, and as I put together the content for this video, I realize that really creating a grammar is really hard work. In fact, it's kind of an impossible task in many ways. And hopefully, as we go through the different criteria that we talk about, you'll get a bit of a feel for that as well. So, what do you look for in a beginning Greek grammar? Well, like I mentioned in the beginning, during this year, I've been reviewing Greek grammars on this YouTube channel with a view to really helping you to choose the best beginning Greek grammar. So I've done this a little bit now, and I wanted to share with you some of the things that I'm looking for as I read through and look at beginning Greek grammars so that you can then sort of take those ideas and then apply them for yourself. So when I look at a beginning Greek grammar, there are three kind of broad categories of things that I'm looking for. The first category is what I would regard as pedagogical methodology, or perhaps pedagogical features. Now, there are a number of things that fit under this subheading. For instance, one of the things that you want to look at very early on in any Greek grammar is the approach that it takes. Now, this is pretty simple in many ways because most of the beginning Greek grammars on the market today take largely much the same approach. For instance, beginning with New Testament Greek by doctors Rob Plummer and Benjamin Merkel, this takes the grammar translate method approach, as does the basics of biblical Greek, and Rodney Decker's reading Koine Greek, and just about every other grammar on the market as well. But there are a few starting to come out that take slightly different approaches. Now, again, if you're looking at a natural language acquisition approach, there'll be resources available for that as well. But one of the first things you're looking for is what is the approach that the grammar you want is going to take. And for the most part, the grammar translate method is the most popular and most well used method by any Greek grammar on the market. So if you're specifically trying to learn the grammar, then a grammar translate method is probably going to be the right way to go. And it's probably the only way you can go, realistically. Unless, of course, you go with Dr. Campbell and Dr. Gibson's book, which is using the PPP method. And there's more details about that in the review for this, which I'll leave a link to up here. Another thing I look at under pedagogy is when are verbs introduced? Because verbs are really, that's the doing words. These are really the foundation of the Greek clause, okay? You cannot get a Greek clause without a verb. I mean, you can get verbless clauses, but they still have a verb implied. But the main idea is that if you can understand the verb, then everything else in the clause fits around that verb. So when are verbs introduced? And in many of the beginning grammars now, the verbs are introduced right at the very beginning. And then the next question that goes with that is, are verbs introduced, are they introducing aorist verbs first or present tense verbs first? So this grammar introduces verbs fairly early on. Decker also does the same very early on with aorist verbs. But then other grammars, such as Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek, leave verbs until chapter 15, really, when you start it, and then he's going to introduce present tense verbs rather than aorist tense verbs as well. So those are the sorts of things that I would consider with regards to when are verbs introduced, because when verbs are introduced, it's kind of when you're starting to introduce the foundation block of the Greek clause, okay? And I think if you're going to do the translation work, you really need to understand verbs reasonably early on. Now, that doesn't mean to say this is not a helpful approach, and you can change the order here a little bit so that verbs are introduced earlier. Mounts has 2 tracks in his, but that's one of the things I look for. When does this grammar introduce verbs? Another thing to watch out for is the target audience of the grammar. Now, how do you know the target audience? Well, largely what you're looking at here is the way the grammar is laid out and the kind of language it uses. Now, curiously, with the 4th edition of Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek, he kind of takes more of an adult, that's probably a bit harsh, but this is more of a, a college level, maybe, maybe seminary, but more college level in terms of its pitch. Now, the previous edition, the 3rd edition, had a lot of illustrations in it, and that sort of just, I think, brought that expected age level down just a little bit. So the 4th edition takes it away and makes that into something much more suited for college age students. Some of these other ones are for older students still, like, beginning with New Testament Greek. This is probably better designed for maybe slightly older students, maybe in their 30s, seminary students, those kinds of things, and they're more, into a graduate degree. So that's also one of the things to look for. What is the target audience for this? Along with that comes questions like, how does the grammar introduce difficult subjects such as the third declension or participles? Because these are often areas that students struggle with, or even second aorists for that matter. How does this grammar introduce these things? Is it introduced all at once, and so there's kind of like a waterfall, pushes you off the edge, and you just got to figure out how to work it on the way down to the bottom? Or do they introduce these things piece by piece? And a lot of grammars now, what they're doing is they're introducing a concept early, and then they reintroduce it more fully later on. A good example of this is reading Koine Greek, and I think also some of these other ones as well. Schwant would be another one, which would introduce these concepts, many concepts early in a brief kind of way, so that you can just sort of understand the basic concept, and then build on this concept piece by piece as you continue to go through the book. So this is another thing to look at, whereas I think some of these books, such as Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek, actually has a little bit more of that waterfall approach, where it just kind of pushes you off the edge and you got to figure it out. Now, the thing with that, neither of these approaches are necessarily better than the other, but it does make a difference for how the student feels as they go through it, right? Neither of them are necessarily right or wrong, but the student can often feel overwhelmed by that waterfall approach, whereas introducing things, it feels like you're just building on things a little bit more slowly, and it's not quite so overwhelming. Another thing to look for under pedagogy is around the issue of memorization and paradigms, right? One of the strengths, I think, of Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek, for instance, is that he has really well laid out paradigms, and there's a small number of them, but there's still this emphasis on you need to know this paradigm and you don't need to know this paradigm. Now, some other grammars, they might have lots of good paradigms in them. So here's a good example with reading Koine Greek. There's a number of good paradigms in them. They're not overwhelming, but there's not the same guidance there about what you do and don't need to memorize, at least not to the same extent as what you get in Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek. So again, these are the sorts of things to look for. Just how much guidance is there around what you do need to memorize and what you don't. A lot of grammars today will argue that they've tried to, in their introduction, they'll say they've tried to eliminate the amount of memorization work, which is to say that more and more grammars are taking an inductive approach rather than that kind of waterfall deductive kind of approach. And this is really, I think, where Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek has sort of broken ground, in the sense that there is a lot of work in here that sort of builds many of these processes and many of these ideas and understandings, particularly around morphology. But again, it's just not an easy thing to manage. And I'll talk about more on why that is in a moment. But one of the questions you want to look at is how many paradigms are there for the student to learn? What sort of value are those paradigms? And then what's the guidance around how to memorize those paradigms? Is there guidance given? I mean, is it just you have to learn this, or does it not even say that? Many grammars don't even tell you, very clearly exactly what you do need to learn in terms of paradigms. Others tell you need to know this, but they don't tell you how. And so you want to look at those kinds of things as well. In a classroom environment, this is not quite so critical, because as a teacher, you can tell the students, this is what you need to memorize, this is what you need to learn, here's a sheet for it, and so on and so forth. But if you're working through this on your own, that kind of guidance is really important. So that's the first thing that I look for in a beginning Greek grammar. What kind of pedagogical features are there, and how are these things designed and going to help the student learn biblical Greek? The second area that I really look at with a fair degree of concern these days is concision versus explanation. One of the things that I've found as I've been teaching through Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek, for instance, and other grammars will suffer from this as well a little bit, is that in some stages there is almost too much information. There's information in here that you don't necessarily need to know when you're going through beginning Greek. And the challenge with this is that you want to have this balance between being clear and concise, but also providing enough explanation so that the student understands how the grammar is actually working. So some grammars are a lot shorter. For example, Ray Summers' grammar, which I reviewed, and I'll leave a link to this up here. This grammar is much more concise, but then that leaves it so that there's actually not as much explanation as you might like. And this is when you get a concise grammar, a grammar that doesn't have all the explanation, a second grammar that has much more explanation is often very, very helpful. And the other thing that comes with this is the kind of teacher that you're working with. How well do they know the language, and how well they are able to distill that down so that you understand it? What I find really helpful is that in times where Mounce can be a little bit difficult to grasp, often pairing that with something like Decker, whose explanations I think are outstanding, is actually a really good way to balance that. And then when you get other grammars, so like for instance, you've got Merkel and Plummer's new grammar, which is a lot shorter, a little more concise, the explanations in something like Decker can be really helpful to sort of give you a second way of thinking about what's in here. But again, this is a more concise grammar, but that doesn't mean the explanations aren't there, right? So you just want to think through that. How concise is this grammar? And does that concision mean that the explanations are wanting, or that the more things could be said? But typically my recommendation is that you're not going to get a great balance on that, and often it's helpful to have two grammars to work with together. And so at the moment I've been teaching through Mounce and telling people to go look at Decker as well. I'm looking at switching that up over the next 12 months or so maybe I'll share more about that in a later video. Another thing that I think would be really beneficial that some grammars have started to do that helps with this whole balance of conciseness versus explanation is to have at the end of each chapter like a little summary of here's the things you need to know. And this is where I think Decker really shines. He's got these built in to every single chapter. At the end of the chapter you've got these rich explanations, but at the end of each one he's telling you exactly what you need to know. Mounce doesn't quite do that. He has summaries of the content he's taught you, which is good, right? That's a great intermediate step. But really, when you get to the end of the chapter and you've been taught all this stuff and he's just summarizing it, you want to know which of this is really important and which of this is less important. Okay, so this is, again, this is a great grammar, and you can see my review of this up here. But again, this is one of the things to think about. Does this grammar give you a summary? And I think really where I came across this for the first time, it was with Biblical Greek Made Simple, and Danny Zacharias has done a great job of telling you at the end of each chapter what you need to know. Decker does the same thing as well, but this is a really helpful feature because when you're going through a book that's got quite a bit of explanation, it can be really helpful just to have at the end of the chapter, if you've missed all of what I've just said, here's the 3 or 4 or however many things it is that you do need to know before you go on. So you want to capture a balance of conciseness, like not too much information that it's overwhelming, but on the other hand you want to have good, clear explanations, and explanations that make it so that the reader, the student, can really understand what's being taught. So that would be one other thing I'd look at. So pedagogical features, which is where I've spent most of the time so far, and then conciseness or explanations. Those are another really key area. There is one more area that I think is really important to think about when it comes to looking at a beginning Greek grammar, and that is the language features itself. Now, for example, here in the 4th edition of Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek, he's made the decision to drop deponency, which I personally think is the right thing to do, but he hasn't really embraced verbal aspect in the right way. By contrast, you've got somebody like Constantine Campbell who's got a really good approach to verbal aspect, but then you've got this very short guide without necessarily good explanations in it, which takes a non-GTM, a PPP approach to pedagogy. So again, you've got a different approach here. And then in something like Ray Summers, you've got obviously conciseness and reasonable explanations. So it's very short. But the problem with this is that it's quite dated now. So, he's got deponency. He teaches deponency in here. He doesn't know about verbal aspect at all. So he's teaching time in the indicative mood as part of the tense form itself, and so on. And so these are the kinds of things that you want to look at. So what are the language features that this particular grammar presents? And what are my views? And this is where it really starts as a teacher. As a teacher, you've got to know what your views on this grammar is. What is your view on the language changes that have been discussed amongst the scholars and pedagogues over the last decade or two? And what's your position on those? So do you embrace verbal aspect? And if so, do you embrace 2 aspects or 3? Right? I'm a 2-aspect person, but most of these grammars are 3 aspects. Do you embrace deponency still? Do you hold on to deponency, or do you regard that as something that's gone? You're going to want to find a grammar, if you're a teacher particularly, that agrees with your understanding of the language. So that's the third thing you want to look at, language features itself. You need to know what you understand as a teacher about the language and the changes that have taken place over the last 20 years in terms of our understanding of the language, because frankly it's not the language that's changed, it's our understanding that's changed. And you want to understand where you stand with all of that. You want to read the material, read the literature, look at the details, look at the arguments, so that you know for yourself where you stand, and then you can select the beginning Greek grammar based on your knowledge as one of those criteria. So the 3 criteria that I use are, first of all, pedagogical features. Secondly, we've got conciseness and good explanations, and hopefully summaries at the end of each chapter. And thirdly, you've got language features. Where do you stand with regards to the language which has been presented, and the trends or features of the language that have been presented in this particular grammar? So let me ask you though, what do you think is most important as you look at a beginning Greek grammar? What are you looking for in a beginning Greek grammar as a student or as a teacher? And what are you thinking of incorporating in if you're writing one? I'd love to hear that too. Leave your comments in the comment section below. I look forward to hearing from you there. If you're interested in learning Biblical Greek, I have beginning Greek courses starting throughout the year, and if you're interested in learning more, go download my Roadmap to Mastery at masterntgreek.com/roadmap and download it for free, and then when the next release, or the next intake comes up, I'll let you know. Thank you so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you and serving you again in the next video. Until then, keep taking small, consistent steps toward mastery. We'll see you then.